Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Newberry Library. I'm Daniel Green, the president of the library. Tonight's program is being live streamed on Zoom. I know there's hundreds of you out on Zoom. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually. The Conversations at the Newberry series, which is now beginning its 12th season, is generously sponsored by Sue and Melvin Gray. I want to thank Sue and Melvin Gray for their continuing commitment to making conversations like this one possible at the Newberry. Tonight's program is one example of the library's commitment to inspiring learning in the humanities and bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today. Newberry programs are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. Please consider making a gift to the Newberry online at newberry.org. And at that site, you can also learn more about our collections, our exhibitions, our digital resources, our classes, and our free public programs. At the conclusion of the conversation tonight, we invite questions from those of you on Zoom and those of you in the room. Whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us on Zoom, please text your questions for the speakers to this number, 833-899-3399. Tonight, we're gathering to discuss the politics of representing America's past. We're living at a moment when debates about public education and the teaching of American history again have become the subject of much political debate. Of course, this is not the first time, but there's been a particular intensity in the past few years to this debate. We're hearing from teachers all over the country about this. It's a particularly difficult moment in history classrooms. More than 40 states have introduced bills that would limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism, according to an Education Week analysis. 17 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or other avenues. Some of this legislation is trying to stop discussions of particular topics or events in our country's history. As with much political discourse these days, there's a lot of heat to these debates, but not enough light. That's one of the reasons the Newberry wanted to bring together tonight's speakers, Daina Berry and Leslie Harris, together. It's no small task, but I hope in part they'll help us make sense of the debates over the teaching of history, the remembering of history, and the politicization of history today. Dr. Daina Ramey Berry is the Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Berry is a historian, a scholar of the enslaved, and a specialist on gender and slavery, as well as Black women's history in the United States. She's an award-winning author and editor of 6 books. Her most recent collection, A Black Woman's History of the United States, co-authored with Kaylee Nicole Gross, is an empowering testament of Black women's ability to build communities in the face of oppression and their continued resistance to systemic racism and sexism. If you're interested in reading Professor Berry's work, I also highly recommend her award-winning book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh: The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to the Grave in the Building of a Nation. In addition to her work at the university as an administrator and internationally recognized scholar of slavery, Dr. Berry is a sought-after consultant for museums, historic sites, K-12 education initiatives, radio programs, podcasts, and public television. She's received prestigious fellowships for her research from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Association of University Women, and the Ford Foundation. Welcome to the Newberry, Professor Berry. Dr. Leslie M. Harris is Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University. A specialist in pre-Civil War African American history, she has co-authored or co-edited 5 books, including the award-winning In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, and most recently, Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies, with James T. Campbell and Alfred L. Brophy. Harris has also participated in a number of public history projects, including the award-winning Slavery in New York exhibition at the New York Historical Society, the reinterpretation of the urban slave quarters at Telfair Museum's Owen Thomas House in Savannah, Georgia, which included an edited volume called Slavery and Freedom in Savannah that Dr. Berry and Dr. Harris worked on together, and the interactive People Not Property with Historic Hudson Valley. Dr. Harris's work has also been supported by the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, the Mellon and Ford Foundations, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas, and the University of Maryland. And I'm so pleased that Dr. Harris is the inaugural holder of the David L. Wagner Distinguished Fellowship and Lectureship for Humanistic Inquiry at the Newberry Library this year. While she's here, she's currently writing Leaving New Orleans, A Personal Urban History, which is a book that combines memoir with family and urban environmental histories to explore the multiple meanings of New Orleans from its founding through its uncertain future amid climate change. We at the Newberry are so grateful to David L. Wagner and Renee B. Adams for making this fellowship possible. Please join me in welcoming Daina Ramey Berry and Leslie Harris to the Newberry.
Thanks to everyone who's here tonight, and thanks to Daina for coming all the way from California to have a conversation. We have been collaborators for quite a long time on the history of slavery. And I don't think we, though, have really talked with each other very much about when we first learned about slavery as school children, or how we got into the field of slavery as study. So I think we should start there.
That's a good starting point. That's a good starting point. So I grew up in a small Northern California town, Davis, California, where the University of California, Davis is. And my first experience with slavery outside the home was a school-age child when I was, I think, around 5, asking me what it was like to be enslaved. But they weren't asking me it like as an educational lesson. They were asking me really what me and my family had experienced as if we were enslaved. And I remember my mom said I came home and I asked my dad, Daddy, what was it like to be a slave? And I didn't, then they started talking about it. And I think it was these early conversations in the home about the institution of slavery, about how African Americans survived slavery, that sort of sparked my curiosity at a very young age. And then it wasn't until much later in my college years, it wasn't until after I was about a quarter away from graduating that I decided to change majors from econ to history and go on and study slavery. Wow. What about you?
So I grew up in New Orleans, and you might imagine that we talked about slavery all the time. I'm living in the South. New Orleans was the largest center of the domestic slave trade, but it actually wasn't presented that way when I was growing up. And I think there were a few moments that I remember. So there was a school trip to the French Quarter, and probably those of you who visited the French Quarter did not visit on a school trip, but when you live there, you go on a school trip. And there was a wax museum, and in the wax museum was a wax model of this woman, Madame Lalaurie, who was supposed to be the worst enslaver of all time. And there were horrible depictions of the torture, literal torture that she put her enslaved people, chaining them in the basement and all these things. But the other way I think I learned, like you, was through family, like books that we read, books that were in the house. There's one book in particular that I think about a lot, which is called Growing Up Black, which had, Frederick Douglass. You read that?
Yeah. Read that, yes.
From Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington all the way into the Civil Rights Movement. So these were the sections of Black biographies, autobiographies that were about childhood. But I don't have a lot of memory about learning about slavery in school. And I went to an all-Black Catholic school, K through 8, Black nuns, the whole thing. But I don't have a lot of memory at that time.
But I bet one of your turning points was Roots, right?
Oh, everybody watched Roots in 1976.
We watched it. Yep, yeah. We watched it as a family, and we talked about it. And that was the first time we saw slavery. Like, it's one thing to hear about it, to talk about it, to read about it, but it was the first time that I think we witnessed it, right, in a film setting. Yes. So that was, I think, a really key turning point and I think I went through phases of, wanting to embrace the history, but then being a little ashamed of it, not quite knowing what to do with it, and then just growing to love the history of slavery and finding a lot of power and strength in these stories.
You're totally right about Roots. That was a huge moment. And now as an historian, I've looked at Roots as what was that moment, because I was a kid when it happened, but that was, at the time, the most watched show in America. Everyone watched it. It was talked about all the time. And it's kind of hard to imagine that kind of moment today in our nation, given not only the division that we're going to talk about in a minute, the politics, but also just how the media has expanded. I mean, this was still a time, 3 mainstream, and then public TV. Those were our television channels.
There's only a few. We're dating ourselves here, but there's only a few channels.
There are only 3 channels. So
yeah.
So I wanted to start there with this conversation because so much of the tension with this particular set of history wars is about what do we teach our children. And it's not just our K through 12 children, it's clearly also our students in college who, for the purposes of this argument, are often also presented as children who are being indoctrinated
Exactly.
for some people. For other people, are seen as too woke and therefore not understanding these
And also, I
histories.
think part of this moment is how does learning this history make you feel? How does it make you feel about yourself? How does it make you feel about your community? How does it make you feel about our country? I think that's where it's sort of become a little bit more tense, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and when you said that you felt ashamed about slavery, I had never had that feeling.
Really? Well, maybe it was because I wasn't growing up in all black schools with all black teachers.
Could be.
You know, I was in an environment where I didn't see anybody that looked like me except for my parents and the 10 other black students that went to my high school that had 300 plus students. You know, it was a very small community. So I think we got the affirmation from home, from the black community in Oakland that my parents took us, to go to events for, to go to San Francisco. So they made sure we knew who we were, we had an identity, but it was something that they had to make an effort. I think you were in an environment where
Majority black city, majority black school, majority black church, all of the things. Yeah, it's true.
we were the opposite.
That
So
makes a lot of sense.
I think that could settle a little bit about. And it's not that I wasn't happy to be black. I've always been, comfortable with that and proud. But it was more about how I was treated in the classroom, ridiculed, people wanting to pet me, play with my hair, all these kind of things that you kind of go through, when you're an outsider or an outlier in that community. And so then there was I had identity questions for a while, just trying to make sense of it. And my parents always just reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed. And I grew up with black as my favorite color, and just really affirming that. And that changed, but it was like a battle against all the external forces around me. And I don't think you had that kind of setting in the way in which you grew up.
No, I didn't. That was not for K through 8. No, definitely not. And then by the time I got to high school, I could handle it.
Yeah.
So, well, let's talk about this moment, but also about some important precursors, I think, to this moment. One of which is this is not the first time that this phrase "history wars" has been used.
No, it's not.
We could go all the way back even to the 60s and 70s, and maybe a little bit more internal to the historical profession, but wars among historians, professional historians, about what is the meaning of slavery, who gets to write about slavery, what should we say about slavery. But I think the set of history wars in the United States that's most similar to this moment is in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And there were two big things that happened. One was around the museum, the Smithsonian, and the Enola Gay controversy. Does anyone remember that? Yes. I see a lot of heads nodding. So that was a big one. And then the same time, mid-90s, was the war over the history standards.
Right.
And
there was one other thing I would add, though.
Oh.
In addition to the war of the history standards, the war about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, that was like around mid-90s, and the whole DNA scandal. All
that
around
was
the
all
same
the same
period.
time.
Yeah.
I had not put
I
the
just
Thomas
thought about
Jefferson-
that just now when you were talking about that.
Okay, so that's three things.
Mhm.
Yes. So just as a reminder for those who don't know about the Enola Gay controversy, this is the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And at that moment, there was a decision to commemorate the end of World War II and to bring out the Enola Gay and to, I think, contextualize it.
Right.
And that led to, I think, several years of discussion and debate. How do we talk about the end of World War II? How do we talk about the only, thank goodness, we hope to continue, the only time that a bomb had been dropped on a civilian population, on any population? And they could not come to an agreement. The Smithsonian, our Smithsonian, our National Museum could not come to an agreement on how to display this plane, how to contextualize that moment, how to talk about the end of World War II, and they eventually shelved this large exhibition. The director of the museum resigned, and when you read about it, you can see that there was just no ability to come to a meeting of the mind. There was no compromise that could be had. And that was a huge moment, and I think for many people in public history at the time, a huge failure. And I was just finishing my PhD at that time, so I kind of knew about it, but I was thinking of other things as well.
So I have a question though for you, as you were witnessing that. What kind of questions did it raise for you? Because you didn't know then that you were later going to be consulting on a number of museum projects, exhibitions, film projects, house museums.
I had no idea. At that time, most historians that I knew were not trained to think that they would consult outside of teaching and writing our own books. It was not something that I was trained for. So when I began to move into the museum world, I moved in very much as, I've learned these things about history, what do you want to know? Not as someone who thought about how to present history. And that is something I mostly learned on the job. On the consulting job, just to be clear, by talking with museum professionals. And so to have a museum, a white museum, that museum was founded in the late 18th century, that had never really embraced its role in African American history or itself as a repository of materials of African Americans, and what would it mean for them to take on, and this was after the burial ground, the Negro, quote-unquote, Negro's burial ground was founded. So this is about almost a decade later, this majority white, historically white museum and archive was going to take on this major interpretation of slavery in New York. And that was very stressful. It was very stressful. I was young enough that mostly, after I made one outlandish suggestion, I let the adults in the room manage most of it. But I got to see the politics of what it takes for a museum to decide to turn the page on some older histories and to try something new. And it's not easy. No. They were literally overturning a couple of hundred years. Mm-hmm. And so I would imagine similarly with the Smithsonian and the Enola Gay, except remember that many of the people who were active in World War II were still alive. Exactly. And it was not only history, it was their lives that were being reinterpreted.
Yeah, it's one thing to write about and talk about people that are no longer here, but when you have people that experience that moment, their interpretations matter as well, and they may not think that the way that the museum or the historical society is portraying that experience is accurate. So there's a sort of a different level of engagement that you have to have with members of the community that might have experienced that historical moment, right?
Exactly.
So that also reminds me of, I should say, like you mentioned it earlier, we did this probably 10 years when we worked on slavery and freedom in Savannah. The Owens Thomas House in Savannah it's an urban house museum. Leslie was coming off of the experience of working on slavery in New York with Ira Berlin and putting this great exhibit and I published a book off of that as well. And then she got asked to do this project in Savannah and invited me to join. And I think it was, when we look at the whole project as a whole, we spent, remember the first time we walked in there and they were like, oh, there's, 12 enslaved people affiliated with this house. And we were like, really? That doesn't seem like that many. And they were like, yeah, but the names are different. We're trying to figure out the rotation. And so we said, well, we'll do some research and try to help understand the history of the families that lived here, the owners that lived in the house, because I really wanted to portray more than the silverware and the china that was in the room. And they wanted to talk about the people that lived in the house. And so that's why they brought us on board. And we ended up finding over 300 enslaved people that were connected to this family. And how many was it 11 satellite plantations? Yeah. 11 satellite plantations throughout the state of Georgia. And it just changed the whole nature of the story. And they had spent years reinterpreting it, applying for more grants. They redid the space so that you could actually walk through and understand what the cooks experienced when they were in the kitchen, what did the butlers experience when they were upstairs serving food. And they retold the story of that house, but this time they included enslaved people. And that was a really interesting, almost 10 years that we spent on that, right?
We spent 10 years.
And they're still doing it.
They had spent, even before we arrived, they had spent at least a decade. Yeah. And then I think we might have spent closer to 15 years with them, off and on, because they would get funding and then stop and reinterpret it. And so.
And then now that's continuing. They're doing a post-slavery in the after. Right. They're doing I forgot the title of it, but they're doing it with Melissa. why am I drawing a blank on her name? At Rutgers. Sorry, Melissa. And Talitha LaFloria. They're doing an edited volume on slavery and its aftermath in that same community.
Right. So we bring this up because one of the elements of the history wars is this idea of many museums across the country are reinterpreting their sites. They're bringing in more African American history. And that is becoming threatening. For some people, it is aligned with the taking down of Confederate monuments in many places.
And flags.
And the taking down of Confederate flags and other Confederate memorabilia. And part of what the current history wars, the attempt by state legislatures, well, to pass laws, I say attempt, they have passed laws, as Danny said, to limit what can be taught in these schools, is a response to the fact that many museums, many locales have already begun reinterpreting the histories that they tell. They have broadened who makes up that history. And in some cases, it takes significant time and resources. And so the stories are changing around us. And so as much as we are in a backlash moment, I do want to say, before we talk a little bit more about this moment, that we are also, I say this a lot, I'm going to say it to you, that I don't think all the feathers are going to go back in that pillow. And that, our students are already walking into the classroom. We both have had about 20 to 30 years of college level teaching. They're walking into the classroom knowing more on African American history than I've ever seen. And that's because we have had many successes in diversifying our history, and actually Native American history as well.
Absolutely. And it's now, there's a lot more activism in the K through 12 area. You now have different states that are offering, AP actually offers an African American elective course, and that's just new this year. Then there's other states that have ethnic studies requirements, like a 1-credit course, and those, now they're then parceling that out into like Native American studies, Asian American studies, Mexican American studies, African American studies. And so now students are coming to college classrooms with much more knowledge of American history, much more well-rounded, understanding of the American past, not just from one group of people's perspective. And I think that's changing the kind of conversations that we're having in our college classrooms. And that's been really exciting, I think.
I think we have to understand that change. If we think about Gary Nash, and you were at UCLA at that time, and the history standards, and this is in 1995, that was the first real strong moment where the idea of diversifying the understanding of American history for K through 12 teachers, and then of course their students, really was on the national stage.
It was.
And so he was invited by Lynn Cheney, at that time, who was head of the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, to construct a new curriculum, a national history standards. And he sent her a draft.
Yeah, he did.
And she said, there's too many mentions of Harriet Tubman, not enough mentions of Robert E. Lee, et cetera, no. And so even before, he wasn't done with it. He and his team were not done. And he had consulted with many teachers from across the nation, academics. He himself, of course, was a very well-known and widely historian. But she pulled the plug on it. And that led to this huge outcry. And so very much like our time, our moment that we're in, this idea that academic historians were indoctrinating students. They wanted to talk about these quote-unquote negative histories of slavery. Now, the thing is, he did finish a version of this. And it is online. You can look at it. He also printed a version. 100,000 copies were printed, and they immediately went out into the world. So 100,000 teachers and their departments took up these history standards. So another example of the feathers not going back in the pillow by any means. So I really want to start our understanding of this history war in that moment, that this has been something that we have been working on, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, that as we discover new history, how do we make sure that that new history gets out to K through 12 teachers, to museums, and to other people who want it? With any of these, if people don't want to read it, they don't have to read it.
Right.
So, but there you can see that there's a lot of paranoia
There is.
about what's happening, and I think again about the success that this has had.
And I remember, like, I was in graduate school and I took classes from Dr. Nash at the time, and it was a battle. I mean, these were wars. These were verbal wars. You could see it. He was being, attacked in, newspapers. Like the press was attacking him. And as a graduate student, it was interesting to witness that as I look back on that experience. And I think, what did that do? Like, we've talked about, like, one of the questions I had for you, that I wanted to ask you was, what did you know you were going to be a public historian, a public figure, that you speak and consult on all these projects? And I didn't know it, but I think I had a model among some of the faculty members that were involved in those history standards controversies in the 90s. I didn't know it, but I saw them speaking back to people that were questioning our profession, and that's happening now. People are saying that we're rewriting history and we're changing the narrative. I said, well, it's like when you have a computer and you need to, the computer needs to do an upgrade, and you have to, like, shut it off and it has to, like, upgrade overnight. We're doing the same thing with history. We learn, we find new documents. People donate records that were not available, that change the way we think about a particular moment. And we have to then go back and add that to the history books. It's not that we're changing the story, we're adding more depth to it. So I say we're just refreshing the same way we update our computers, we're updating our history books. So
I would say it's the same way we update our medical science.
yeah, exactly.
I've actually written an article with Karen Wolf, a good colleague and friend, where we use that method. You would not want 1950s cancer science dealing with your 2022 cancer.
Exactly.
And certainly in thinking about histories of slavery and race, we just have learned more, which is not to say that, well, anyway. But the other thing I want to say about that, this updating piece, we sometimes as historians dance around the fact of what a difference who is doing the history makes. I'm going to go there. I mean, the historical profession is much more diverse.
It is.
Many more women, many more people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, it's that we came in with different questions.
Mm-hmm.
Last week, I had the pleasure of meeting with Clint Smith, who wrote this amazing book, How the Word Is Passed. And he wrote it for his 15-year-old self, who had very specific questions about being a young Black man growing up in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And his questions led to new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
You had different questions growing up in California than I would have had growing up in New Orleans or thinking about New York. And I think that is sometimes used against us, but it is an important part of what's happening. The profession has diversified, higher education has diversified, our students have diversified. They are sometimes asking us questions that we have to find the answers to.
Right.
And when that happens, the historical profession has to change.
And I think also what's nice about that is that the different questions that people are asking, they're based on their experiences and the things that they learned. Like I had a student who when I was at Michigan State, I tried to get people to write about enslaved people with disabilities. And so in my classes, I would always talk about it. Like, this is a great dissertation topic. Somebody needs to do this one day. And I had a student later on that was trying to figure out what she wanted to do. And she came up to me and she said, you've been saying that in class. And she said, I grew up in a household where we did sign language because my brother was deaf and I have a disability, and I never thought about it. And she started asking these questions about disability and slavery that I would have never asked because she saw things differently, and ended up publishing a wonderful book about a year ago. And that's what you mean, like the diversity of the experiences and the stories, and those diverse experiences lead to different types of questions that allow us to go deeper into this history. And I think that's the beauty of being a historian. I like that about it.
Yeah, it can be. It can be, yeah. Another way in which you and I have had really different experiences, I think, in our careers is the kind of schools we've taught in.
Yes.
And I've mostly not planned at all, but taught in private, elite, I would say, Research One institutions. And you have taught more.
Large public institutions.
And that also affects sometimes what we can say, what we teach, how we teach, who we teach.
Exactly.
So I don't know if you want to talk about, because I think the pressure, we both can sometimes experience pressure, but I think the pressure that you experience around teaching because you're in public institutions is akin to the pressure that many K through 12 teachers experience.
And they've shared that. The K through 12 teachers, particularly that are working in states that have a little more tighter controls on what they say and what they teach, or the legislator has already passed laws about what can be taught. are really screaming out for help now. Leslie and I do workshops with K through 12 teachers throughout the year, and sometimes over the summer. So we're constantly interacting with educators, and they're saying, like, when I did a workshop this summer, and the teachers from Texas were really saying, we need help. And we need help from outside of the state. We need help from people that are at other states to help advocate. And they were like, other teachers were like, what do you need? What do you mean you need help? They're like, I could not go, our school was across the street from a plantation. I could not take the students on a field trip to visit that plantation. It is literally, I can see it from the window. She was prevented from doing that. Another teacher said that the superintendent had threatened some of their pensions. Another person was in court by parents that were taking him to court for talking about some aspect of slavery and teaching it, and it said that their children felt bad about their history and that this was against the law. And so that's very real. Now, as a faculty member at a public institution, we're publicly funded. And so there's certain things that they didn't, at certain institutions, I won't name names, but it won't be too hard to figure that out. I wasn't able to say certain things, and I had to run it by legal. And they had to make sure that that statement was okay and acceptable because there's a board of regents, there's a state governor with a very big personality that might not give the university funding if we say certain things. And it wasn't, and you could say that challenges academic freedom, but then they say, well, you can teach whatever you want in your class, but you have to be careful what you say publicly as a representative of the state institution. So I don't think you necessarily experienced that at some of the private schools that you taught at, right?
No, I haven't. Truth be told, I think sometimes in private institutions where it comes up is when you're seeking funding or when a private donor wants to donate to fund a particular kind of curriculum. And those sometimes pop up on the radar as a point of influence. But I've never had to run past legal.
I should say it depends on what state you live in too, because I'm at a public school now, and I wouldn't have to run anything by legal.
Right.
So I think it really depends on where you are as well.
Right.
The state politics matter. I guess that's what I would say.
Right. But I worry. I don't think it is outside the realm of possibility that out of fear, other institutions could begin to worry. There is often a nervousness, regardless, that you'll lose donors, that
Right.
you will, be attacked in some way.
Right.
And so it's a concern. It is a concern.
It is, and I worry that it's always elevated during election years, and particularly the last several elections that we've had, as our government and the people that are serving in our government changes. I think you're seeing more tense, kinds of conversations that I remember witnessing. Even when I can think of, we've always taught during election years, but these last few elections have been a little bit more tense in the classroom. And even the students will say that to us. They feel stressed, and that's very, very interesting. And to unpack that in the classroom can be a challenge sometimes.
So you said that your K through 12 teachers were looking for help from outside the state, and I'm wondering what that would even look like.
Statements of support, in solidarity of, uplifting academic freedom. And we actually talked about on this call, like how they asked, how can we be supportive? Well, maybe if you we can't say certain things, but can you say them for us? So whether that's a social media campaign, letters to the governor, letters to the school district, as long as it didn't come from them where they were worried about their own personal, safety or their finances, their family safety, they felt like that would be one way to support. And I think that they're still needing that.
Mm-hmm. I guess I wonder where the role is for parents of students as well, especially in the K through 12 system, and whether or not parents have a role in that.
They have a big role. There's a great podcast called South Lake, if no one's heard it. It was exactly about this, about a school district in near Dallas. And it was based on the school board and the parents going after something. And it just became very, very charged. But it was a powerful podcast that I highly recommend. But you do see the parents. Some of this is sparked because of the parents filing a complaint, or a parent not comfortable with the material. Or there's also the epic fails where a teacher does do something like have people stand up on the chair and auction off the black students. We've seen that it's happened, and that's not a North-South thing. That's happened in all kinds of, all over the United States.
One other thing I wonder about, and this is for teachers, it's also about students, and it's, so we're all swimming through this very toxic political environment. And we try to give teachers the material they need, but like us, they came through the same systems where it wasn't talked about. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is just this last example made me think of it is you have well-meaning teachers who are trying to teach this difficult material. They're trying to do the right thing. And students are stressed about it. Teachers are stressed. How do we also just continue to create a broader atmosphere where someone can make a mistake and not be completely turned out?
Yeah.
Where people can begin to get more comfortable with teaching these difficult topics. I feel like that's the thing that's getting lost. There's so much heat
Yes.
and criticism, but it's not criticism in a way that's at all helpful to actually teaching well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talked about in this workshop that I did with the Gilder Lehrman Institute this summer was bringing more primary documents, like giving the teachers primary documents to teach about historical moments. Because part of the charge in some of these states is that there's a certain angle or a certain perspective of history that's being taught. But if you just say, okay, we're looking at a historical moment. Let's look at people that were actors and players in that moment. What were they saying? So let's look at all the people that were at this political rally. What kinds of comments do we have from that rally? That way, it's like it's not the teacher's opinion. It's really just really putting that moment in the right historical context. So I think that, and then doing bits of history. Like, so what, they don't have a lot of time for these lectures. Like we do sometimes, we have whole classes on the Civil War and Reconstruction. You could do a whole semester of that, right? Some instructors only have like 48 minutes to cover like 200 years of history. And so having those little smaller bits and pieces, so giving them documents that are palatable, that they can interpret, contrasting documents that they can then work with one another on. I think that's one way to do it.
Yeah, that sounds really helpful. So is there any, do you have an example from when you were teaching in Texas with your teachers where you felt hopeful, like there was something that, they were in a difficult situation, but you feel like they did something? And
yeah, there's lots, and that's what keeps me motivated. The teachers had a hunger for learning, and like you just said a few minutes ago, it's not their fault that they may not have learned the history a certain way. And that was I remember that like epiphany moment when I was like, wait a minute, they weren't taught this, so they need to learn how to teach it because they didn't learn it this way. They didn't learn history. They learned history in a way that was much broader, that didn't include different groups of people. And so, but they were hungry for it. I love the fact that they came and said, I want to learn. Even though it's not on the test, and we have to teach for the test in some states, most states, even though it's not on the test, I still want I want to sneak it in. So they were talking about different ways that they would teach a certain aspect of American history, and they were very creative about the choices of primary documents and narratives and stories that they were sharing to show like the diverse aspect of history. And I really thought that's always encouraging.
My favorite moment, the full year of the pandemic, so that would have been summer 2021, we did a teacher workshop on Zoom. So all I could think was, we had two sections of 40 teachers, K through 12 teachers, who had just spent the whole year on Zoom. And then they were going to spend an extra week with us on Zoom. So the first thing I said to them was, I can't believe you're here. Thank you for being here. If there's any way that I can reach across the airwaves and help you, make you feel good about being here, tell me, because I want to do nothing more than support you during this moment. So I just say that to say that sometimes we forget how dedicated teachers can be to doing this work. I would not have been on a Zoom after a year of teaching K through 12 on Zoom. But those teachers, so we asked them, like, why are you here? Like, instead of having a vacation, watching TV, just like trying to forget last year happened. And we got such amazing answers. One fourth grade teacher said, my 10-year-old students came in and said, what is this slavery thing? What is this about? Like, and she said, I have to have an answer for them. Like, she didn't feel like she could just, do it the way she'd always done it. We had a lot of teachers that summer who were dealing with something that I had never had as a kid. I don't know if you had Colonial Day, where
No, we did not have that in Davis.
I didn't have it, but where students dress up probably around this time of year before Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And so a lot of parents and students were saying, well, how am I dressing up like this? And anyway, they were trying to rethink, how can we still have hands-on learning, but in a way that's more inclusive and not either whitewashing the history or doing something inappropriate with oppression and the history. So to work with these incredibly creative teachers, you really sometimes realize that there can be all of this going on up here. The politicians are making hay, they're passing laws, they're doing things, and you have to beat that back. Someone has to deal with that.
Right.
But then every day there are these teachers, and they get up in the morning and they go to a summer workshop, and they come back and they say, well, I'm going to try a little bit of this year, and I'm going to do a little bit of that.
The creativity
and the refusal to give in. They know that there is more to be done, and they're ready to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
So I think we're ready for questions.
You probably have in the audience and on Zoom, I'm sure.
All right, so my first question is, do you have another hour? Because we have really good questions here. No, well, I want to apologize in advance. We're not going to get to every question. We do have some really fantastic questions. So one is about the 1619 project, which hasn't come up, and I wonder if in answering the question, you might just set up the 1619 project. But this questioner is just trying to understand why this is at the center of the storm. So they ask, why is the 1619 project considered so controversial? And do you think that these are kind of two separate questions, but do you think that something is being lost because schools are not emphasizing memorizing dates and historical facts? These are two very separate things.
Part one, I'll do part two.
Okay, I'll do part one.
Yeah.
So the 1619 project. So I have we've been dealing with the storm, the fallout from the 1619 project now is going on 3 years. 3 years. I think I've thought a lot about it, and I think a lot of things about it. One is, why it has been so controversial is not because of the quote-unquote mistakes that were made or the disagreements over interpretation. And I'm not going to go into all that, but if you want to have a drink after, we can talk about because some of the things that are in the 1619 project are a snapshot of what we're thinking about as historians, but it's not settled history. And some things are mistakes, but historians make mistakes all the time.
Right.
I still think that the reason the 1619 project is such a flashpoint is because a large number of people appreciated it, are reading it, are using it, and teachers are going to use it, and they're going to use what works. They're going to not use what doesn't. And now we do have an internet full of, we think this works and this doesn't, and so they can use it in a smart way. I think that the fact that a Black woman took the history of slavery and said that it is just as important, if not more important, than what happened in 1776, and said that in the New York Times, which has always been our quote-unquote newspaper of record for our moment.
Yeah.
And I think people just can't handle that.
I agree.
It was a Black takeover, and that is why it has created such a furor. So following on a Black president, what many people believe is the leading newspaper in the country got behind slavery in a way, in an interpretation of slavery in a way that it had never done before. And it was an interpretation that was very clear about present day legacies.
Exactly.
And all of those things can be discussed and debated. I have no problem with having a discussion and debate about it. Yeah. But a lot of the things that were in that magazine are actually, to some degree, verifiable. I mean, you can argue, but...
Yeah. And I think it's also the centering of slavery as part of our founding story. Yes. And I think that's what also really touched some nerves, is that that's the part of our history that it's the stain and we want to look past it. We want to move beyond it. None of us were here, all that separation and social distance that we want to put to that experience. That's part of it. It's like she made us think about it or brought it to the attention and using that date. So the second part of the question was about dates. Now, the reason why I said I wanted to take this part of it is that I tell my students that I want them to walk out of my classrooms with a good understanding of whatever my subject is. If it's U.S. history or African American history, what have you. I want them to be able to have a conversation with an aunt, a grandmother, a cousin, a nephew, whatever, a relative of theirs afterwards, to be able to say that they can talk about this history. And I said, I don't want you to, it's not about memorization, it's about understanding. Now, but there are like a few key dates that I will ask them to know, but it's probably not more than like 6 or 7 dates total. And 7 is probably on the high end. I would rather them know about the experience of slavery, even if they don't know that the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808, and and slavery ended in 1865. Those are important dates, but it's not like I'd rather them be able to talk about that experience. So that's where
I will
I am.
add just a bit to that also, is that I remember facts and dates when they are part of an interpretation.
Exactly. Yep. That's it.
That's the way.
So people want to get at the use of wars. There's a lot of question just about the use of wars. So I'm going to group a couple questions here. Some people say, or one person asked, please give specific examples of the two sides in the wars. Can you distinguish backlash versus war? Another person asks. Another person asked, do backlashes or wars have a playbook? Have historians mapped this? So I think people it might be that history wars is a new term to some people listening today, and just I think they're trying to better understand how these wars actually work, and what are the sides of the wars.
Well, first for the mapping, there are scholars that are, there's a colleague of mine from UT Austin, Erica Basimic, who created this mapping timeline technology called CLIOVIS, CLIOVIS, where you can do a timeline of different events or arguments. And she had her students do this, where you can put in events and incidents that are happening. She did it with the riots and the social unrest of 2020, Black Lives Matter, I think it was. And the students just kept filling it out. So that's just one example of like how you can visually see some of the debates. But I think those are really good questions. One, because I think when we think about war, we think about World War I, World War II, the Civil War. We're thinking about specific, but these are ideological and intellectual wars that we're referring to. And they've always been a part of any type of academic setting, and even in the history profession, because there's been schools of thought that have sort of changed shape over time, like the Dunning School, and you go through different waves of the historiography of how historians interpret history. And so when we talk about history wars, we're talking about, and Leslie gave a really good example about when Dr. Nash, there was this bean counting, like when you talked about this person too many times and another person not enough times. So there's a battle for space in textbooks. Who are you going to cover? Which figure, if you're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which artists are you going to cover? If you're going to talk about women's suffrage, what women are going to rise to the top? So I think wars in generally is this battle between whose stories are told and from what perspective.
I would add, I feel like we're in, I'm a peace-loving person, so I hesitate to say it, but I do feel that the passing of laws, the saying you cannot say this, that to me speaks to a kind of to a warlike setting, and it becomes destructive. I think the sides. I think there are more than one side, but
multiple.
On one side, though, is a group that is sparked by the 1619 Project, and there are very specific people who are taking this stance, and also the critical race theory, which we haven't talked about, but it's all part of the same discussion, and they are very clear that they want to shut that down intellectually, politically, in our schools, that it isn't, not that it's illegitimate, but that it cannot be discussed. And so when you move to the point where there is a law against discussing it, I think, and you tell people that they should report people, I think then we are moving towards
some battleground.
At the very least.
So you signaled this perfectly. There's a lot of scare quotes in this question, so I want to make sure I get them. Is critical race theory a war?
The teaching of it is.
Is it a war? What is?
Oh no, critical race theory is not a war.
It's not a war. The teaching of it is.
Yeah. Can you explain I think this person's trying to understand why critical race theory has come to the center of so many of these discussions about history wars
It's
today.
being used as a shield to not discuss a certain part of history. So it's that shield. I mean, this is my interpretation. It's being used as a shield or a puppet, whatever. I'm not great at metaphors, but it's being used as this instrument to then say we're not going to talk about race. And really, critical race theory comes out of Harvard University. It comes out of Kimberly Crenshaw, and this is the intersection of race and law. Okay, it's not being taught in K through 12. I don't teach critical race theory in my history classes. So that whole idea of when you talk about that, now they're saying like anytime you talk about race and you're critical, now they're assuming that teachers are teaching critical race theory. They haven't learned it. They don't know what it is. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but it's being used as a way to prevent people from talking about race, racism, and the law in classrooms.
The only other thing I'll add is that there is a playbook on, I mean, I sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but there have been articles written, I think, in either the Atlantic, in the Atlantic, about there are individuals in think tanks who have specifically worked to create these campaigns, which is another warlike word, to confuse what critical race theory really is, which is, again, is legal term in law schools, which most of us don't deal with in that way, and use them as a way to stop the discussion of history, of the history of slavery, of the history of Black people, and history of Native American. I mean, we could go on and on. So to go back to the war question, I mean, there is a campaign to shut these ideas down.
Two very similar questions came in. Many people argue that figures in the past can't be held to our standards today due to them living in another time. How do you feel about how we should deal with different historical figures who are somewhat problematic now, or maybe more than somewhat problematic, but were normal in the past? There's a lot of concern, and then someone else asked, there's a lot of concern that we're judging historical figures by today's standards of morality. What barometer should we use in this question?
So I think that, I love this question.
This is
my great question.
This is your favorite.
Okay, so my favorite person to talk about, probably not surprisingly, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so so first of all, I don't think of myself as judging Thomas Jefferson. I think of myself as saying he owned enslaved people. He had a long-running affair, now proven beyond with our new DNA technology.
And DNA confirmed
and
in the 90s.
children with an enslaved woman of African descent. And those are facts. I agree with Annette Gordon-Reed, amazing scholar on this, that in his time period, yes, there were enslavers, white men, who had long-term relationships with Black women who were enslaved or free, and that is part of his time period. Now, other people do, they hear this and they feel some kind of way about it, but I don't control that. I'm just telling you what I know from history. The other thing I would say about his time period is that, yes, he was in a time period when many people owned slaves. He was also in a time period when many people critiqued slavery. General Lafayette said to him and many of the founding fathers, you're in this war, why don't you wrap up that slavery thing while you're at it?
Exactly.
And they said, not yet. The slavery issue, the Quakers they divested by the early years of the Revolutionary War. These were live issues that were being discussed and debated. Now, we could have a conversation about what it would have taken to end slavery then, but recall that the states north of Delaware did put slavery on the road to ending at the same time period that Thomas Jefferson kept going into debt and was unable to
Exactly.
therefore free his slaves upon his death. People were divesting themselves of slavery during this time period. People experienced slavery as enslavers and became anti-slavery as a result. So this idea that this is a time period in which there were no critiques of slavery and no one was thinking about it, Thomas Jefferson himself was thinking about it. The wolf by the ears, the night, the fire bell in the night. He knew. He himself predicted the Civil War in essence.
But I mean, we even look at if we're looking at the primary documents, like I said earlier, in their journals they struggle. Like you'll see enslavers talking about it. You know, I saw this one ledger that had the work that enslaved people were doing, like 11 people in the fields chopping this. Just all these lists, and then the next page was like a repentant prayer on the whole page. He would just do these chants, and I'm like, he was clearly warring and struggling with this. So this is happening. But I would, to answer that question, is like context. It's just about the historical context. You have to provide that context for that moment, so that we don't make the mistake of trying to judge or think about it or perceive it in today's time. Because I always have to tell students in the class, well, we have a 21st century vantage point, so we know what happened after that. But think about this isolated moment and the people that were there and what was happening, and that's how we need to think about the historical moment. If we bring in all the knowledge that came after that, then we're definitely getting in the way.
I'm going to take one more, and again, I apologize. There's dozens and dozens of really good questions here. I'm going to take one more that is asking about, I think, looking for some positives in this and asking for a way forward, and asking you two as historians, could some of the current problems that we're encountering be remedied even at lower levels of education by a greater emphasis on learning historiography in history classes and learning that part of history is debate and interpretation?
Absolutely, and we do
Absolutely.
this with the K through 12 teachers.
Yeah.
So I work with Historic Hudson Valley, which, similar to what Daina was describing earlier with the Owens Thomas House, has gone on a journey of discovering how in the early 20th century, the people who were in charge of the house covered up the history of slavery, and now they've recovered that history. So as part of our week with teachers, we show the very site that we're on as an example of how history changes, of how people change. I don't think you can teach the history of slavery. Well, you can, but the history of slavery, the historiography of slavery is so fascinating. It has modeled every history of race, of capitalism, of how we imagine the nation. So that helps, but there's not every K through 12 student or K through 8 or whatever, that it's not always appropriate to bring in the historiography for the students. But I do think it can help the teachers understand that history doesn't stand still. And otherwise we wouldn't have jobs, really.
We sure wouldn't.
Anything to add, Daina?
No, I think I like the idea of talking about historiography, basically how historians teach and think about history at a younger age. Whenever we start our workshops, the workshops I've done, I always contextualize it for the teachers. This is what the first scholars that wrote about this topic, they wrote in the 1920s. This is what happened in the 1930s. I sort of go like a brief lecture on how our understanding of that history has changed over time so that they have that context. And it gives them the skill to tell their students that you might interpret history when you write a book, or if you decide to become a historian, your book is going to be different than the books that they read in that class. So I think it's allowing students to see that they're active participants in the history is really important.
I would add one more thing. I've been thinking recently about the Confederate monuments, and people, when those monuments came down, people said, you're removing the history. And just 2 weeks ago, I realized we didn't remove history. We removed an historical interpretation
of history.
Like, we have actually lived through a public moment of the rewriting of history, of the removal of Confederate monuments and Confederate flags and things like that was a moment when we said, this is not where this Confederate belongs, does not belong in this town square, does not belong on this monument.
There's no connection to the state in some of those.
There's no connection to who we think we are as a nation today. And it was a rewriting of that interpretation. And anyway, that was another way to think about
great
historiography.
example.
We all participated in it in that way.
Exactly.
All right, unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but please join me in expressing our appreciation to Daina, Ramey, and Leslie M. Harris.